Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another Alternate History Hearts of Iron 4 video. It has been a while. Literally 2 weeks since we posted the poll that would actually determine what this video is, because as you all know, what happens with this is that I take the comments that you all put down in the comment section below, and the top 4 most liked suggestions get put in as the next alternate history video idea for us to try and create and see what happens. And I'm sorry about that, it has been a while, but by an overwhelming majority, the lot of you wanted to know, what if the Soviet Union had collapsed before World War II? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Mustache Man over here basically gets an oily feast, and there's not really much that we can do about it, but we're going to have to kind of explain how it is that it all plays out. Spoiler alert, yeah, I know by me saying that, but pretty much that feels like it's kind of an obvious statement for what would happen. Now, as always, in order to be able to tell this story, we need to understand that a series of things had to take place prior to the start of the game in order to create the scenario that we're talking about here in the first place. The Soviet Union is, of course, giant, and if you look at it both in the game and in real history, it is an industrial powerhouse very quickly going into World War II, and definitely afterwards, as it would become the primary rival of the United States in the Cold War. But this only happens because of the rapid industrialization that takes place over the course of the 1920s and 30s, which has a lot of negative effects on many parts of the population, but good effects on others. It's kind of a mixed bag with, of course, a lot of brutality because it's the Soviet Union. In fact, what is crazy about the Soviet Union is that in comparison to every other part of the world, the 1930s, like the early parts of it, were actually phenomenally good for it in comparison to most other places, because the Great Depression that skyrocketed out of the United States to wreck the economy of so many parts of the Western world that were reliant upon the capitalist system, that meant that when the stock market went boom, all of those states were negatively affected. But the Soviet Union, having been cut off from the global financial system and being communist, wasn't. So it actually did phenomenally well over the course of the 20s and especially the 30s, when people thought that was basically going to be impossible. That all being said, though, as I already said, in order for that to happen, the Soviet Union did engage in many, brutal practices for collectivization that did piss off a large percentage of the population that theoretically in this time we can say led to much greater instability. At the same time, if you go and look over in the East, one of the things that was happening around Manchukuo here is that there was a series of border disputes and fights with Japan that could have theoretically escalated to an all-out war, but did not, and Japan and its army was humiliated by the Soviet Union during this time, especially in 1939 during the Battle of Kakengol, which is one of the key things that made Japan go and turn to the Southern Doctrine to actually strike against China, the Philippines, Indonesia, and more for resources instead of invading into Siberia. Theoretically, in this time, we can say that luck was on the side of the Japanese and that they had won all of these conflicts and that the Soviet Union was weaker, which not only leads to many internal problems within the Soviet Union, but simultaneously, it means that in the case of Japan, they do not follow with the Strike South Doctrine, they go north. Along with that, we can actually then assume that Poland in this time, considering the amount of instability that is going on around it, may actually side with Germany more, as considering the instability that will be taking place within the Soviet Union, Germany will likely have a greater degree of influence to be able to rally the people of the Baltic as well as other entities around it to deal with the Soviet Union, which ultimately, historically, was the great enemy that Germany wanted to take out. And so because of that, yeah, we are actually going to be starting the game as Germany in order to be able to explain this, because trying to explain that while going through the Soviet Union seems extremely unrealistic and hard to manage. So here we have Germany in 1936, and we have the Soviet Union in 1936. If you go and look at the focus tree that we have here in the Soviet Union, the path that they're going to be following is the path of Marxism-Leninism, and then the historical route is going down the center, in which we then have all the purges, the destruction of the Trotskyites that perhaps remain, and the consolidation of power under Stalin. But we're not going to say that that happens, or that it starts to happen, but perhaps the backlash is significantly greater than it was in our own time, that Stalin is not as successful in purging out those who are threats to his possible regime, that they are able to rally forces behind them, and that instead of, say, just bending the knee, these lead to their own kind of internal revolution and possibly break out into civil war, because realistically speaking, that was the greatest likelihood to happen at that time, was some kind of internal political dispute spiraling into actual warfare. So because of that, we actually have the Soviet Union set to go down the left opposition route, which literally anything besides following through the center is going to lead to civil war. Like, the only way for the Soviet Union to reform itself is not through some simple political change. It is going to be through mass violence. Is historically that's how Russia kind of works. Does that mean that things immediately collapse in 1936? No, we're going to say that it kind of carries on, but it means that the 1930s are actually shakier for the Soviet Union than what they arguably were. The political, the economic situation, maybe it just was not as good as what it was in our own time. As for Germany, things are going to follow the same kind of path that they did in our own time, but Germany is going to be far more successful diplomatically here than they were, again, in our own time. Does that mean that they can slow down and prioritize economic growth? No, they're still going to go down the historical four-year plan. They're still going to be extremely militaristic, but the targets this time are perhaps going to be far more acceptable, we will say. We need an ambitious plan to provide for rearmament and ultimate self-sufficiency of the nation. This should be achieved within the next 4 years. And so with remilitarize the Rhineland, from here, it just kind of all proceeds as normal. We can't necessarily say anything definitive. Things aren't really going to start to rapidly change until potentially 1937 or 1938, when everything gets significantly more hectic after the Anschluss of Austria, the collapse of Czechoslovakia, and more. As such, Germany largely focuses internally. The ultimate goal of the German war machine is to achieve autarky, to get living space, Lebensraum, for the people of Germany, and from that, to seize all resources for itself, which, yeah, that's what we're definitely going to go for. Yeah, heading into 1937, pretty much every single thing remains the exact same. The only thing that we can arguably say is that perhaps the efforts of the Anti-Comintern Pact are more successful than they were in our own time. Yeah, the Anti-Comintern Pact was something that was established merely as a simple defensive statement against the Soviet Union and communism in general, but perhaps maybe there was more support for it. Maybe this is something that caused some internal alarm within the Soviet Union. Perhaps all that happens. In fact, one of the biggest arguments that we can probably make in this entire time is just a simple factor, is that the Soviet Union performs horribly in the Spanish Civil War. Perhaps, even though, yes, it was a long, drawn-out conflict, and that still happens, the volunteers that go over that would have provided valuable resources and intelligence for the Soviet Union, they fail miserably. The Spanish Republicans are divided even more. The gold doesn't really make its way out of Spain in order to get to the Soviet Union, which gives a boost for their industry. None of these things happen, and they lose thousands of men in horrible disasters that cause, well, a bit of an embarrassment. Yeah, we can arguably say that really, instead of heading into 1939, that maybe by the end of 1937, heading into the beginning of 1938, a full year and a half earlier than what happened in our own time, that the Spanish Civil War winds down and it is a massive victory for the fascist powers supporting the nationalists, which actually means Italy in this time is going to not waste nearly as many resources as they did. And perhaps as this happens, due to the issues that already were underway within the Soviet Union, as Stalin was trying to purge, maybe in this time, we see an internal dispute arise and become an external dispute. Well, I say external as in outside of the immediate political sphere, as the Soviet Union begins to descend into chaos. Perhaps maybe there was an additional agricultural failure. More people were starving. Something occurs, in which case the Soviet Union erupts into violence. The likelihood of this taking place in 1939, right at the beginning of World War II, is extremely unlikely. It is more likely to take place at some point between 1936 and 1937, and this is going to drastically change the trajectory of how things work in Europe, as such conflict would actually be welcomed by much of Western Europe, except for France. France, of course, had a closer relation with the Soviet Union, but the United Kingdom would not necessarily have minded this as much, and Germany, under Mustache Man, would be absolutely ecstatic. And if this had taken place in 1937, then that means that the next 2 years would have drastic shifts in planning which would take place. In a conference recently called by Mustache Man, the Führer shared some of his ambitions for the future expansion of the German Reich. The first such expansion is one that he perceives to be that of little risk. The Austrian people is no difference to ours, and they mostly hold similar views, as proven by the political climate of the country. The Führer believes that such an expansion will be possible to achieve diplomatically, given sufficient time for German-friendly sentiments to grow within the federal state of Austria. We can arguably say in this time that with more resources to be able to spare, that these are able to be pumped into Austria, thus speeding up the process of the Anschluss taking place. So at this point then, my friends, it's the end of 1937, and this is where a series of things are happening in Germany. The foreign reserves of the German Reich are running out. In order to be able to pay for the ambitious rearmament plan, the German state was pretty much using up all the cash that it had in order to be able to purchase things to prepare for equipment, because the German Reich needed trade agreements in order to be able to produce the goods that were necessary for war in the first place, but this was an extremely expensive thing. Thus, in order to keep everything afloat, they had to start taking territory, and they had to start doing it fast. This is exactly why they continued on to take Czechoslovakia in our own time instead of just the Sudetenland, because the reserves of gold within Bohemia were necessary to seize in order to be able to pay for things in the first place. So, Anschluss time. In the aftermath of the Anschluss, this is when Sudetenland then gets its own pressure put upon it, perhaps in this time due to international pressures, and with people being more drawn to the conflict that is happening in Russia, it means that Germany is able to move to secure more territory faster. Wow, that's actually insane. In the span of literally just 4 or 5 months, the Soviet Union healed itself in this time. I mean, I guess we can assume that if there is some kind of like political coup or change or something like that, that it is not going to be something that necessarily destroys the entire country immediately. There likely will be some kind of political change before anything else devolves. However, through the power of console commands, we can make sure that things stay rather spicy. And as the world is significantly more focused on the Soviet Union, because obviously that is where a lot of the craziness is happening, the Munich conference is still going to take place, as Mustache Man is going to be trying to consolidate as much territory as he can in preparation for what he sees as the inevitable victory to come. Following this, perhaps in more rapid order, we can say that the First Vienna War takes place and the fate of Czechoslovakia also occurs. Yes, historically this wouldn't happen until basically a year later, but what we can arguably say is that the effects of the crisis with the Munich Conference are even worse, and this is something that actually causes an internal collapse within Czechoslovakia, more so than it did in our own time, so that perhaps they agree to a more limited puppet status under Germany more peacefully than what otherwise would have happened. And perhaps maybe then through these more successful efforts and seeing specifically what is happening over across the border in Russia, more nationalist sentiments are arising within Poland that perhaps see this as an opportunity to be able to strike and get some revenge for earlier years and take back some territory. The something in Indecza and the Falange have long-standing relationship with the Polish government, but Ignacy Mościcki's continued operation or cooperation with these far-right elements have at last come to his downfall. With their growing influence within the Polish government, Roman Dmowski has now supplanted Mościcki as Poland's new president. It remains to be seen if the new nationalist government believes it can somehow appease foreign powers that are vying for, well, its territory. So, assuming everything that we've been talking about here takes place, Slovakia gets set up as a puppet state, Czechoslovakia pretty much collapses, and then from here, well, we have the setup for whatever it is that we need. Perhaps in this time, because things are taking place earlier and the gold reserves of the Czechs are able to be seized, the German Reich is able to prepare for an earlier war with the Soviet Union, which again was ultimately its goal. The only problem is, in order to be able to get there, it has to be able to go through Poland. And yes, efforts and overtures were made to the Polish government in previous years in order to get the Poles on the German side in order to prepare for such an invasion, but the Polish did not want to go with the German alliance in the same way that Hungary and Romania ultimately would. As such, we can assume in this time that the government of Poland is more amenable to this, whether it's because of internal political changes or whether it is because the weakness of the Soviet Union makes the nationalists within Poland see it as a grand opportunity. The Poles stand in our way for Lebensraum. Still, it's not too late to alter our long-term priorities and seek their friendship instead. The only way this could come is through a trade of territory, Danzig for Slovakia. Poland has already shown some interest in the region by occupying Zaolzie. So, instead of in this time us getting the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the more likely thing is the Beck-Ribbentrop Pact. The Polish government has proposed a pact to support our goals of global hegemony. Clearly, Roman Dmowski is aware that Mustache Man is not satisfied with the border divisions drawn up between Poland and Germany, and thus the Polish foreign minister, Joseph Beck, has been sent to propose an amendment to this deal. Poland agrees to cede the western territories of Poznan, Danzig, and Upper Silesia in exchange for mutual pacts of non-aggression and German protection and guidance against any attempted Soviet invasion. The pact would essentially render Poland as little more than a German puppet, along with ceding the disputed territory on our border. Should we agree? Yes. This happens, and at the same time this happens, overtures are put forth to Japan. We've had a long, fruitful relationship with China, but our ambitions might be better served by instead realigning with our kindred warrior culture Japan, even if it means throwing China to the wolves. We can say, again, from this time, that the Japanese have not focused on the Strike South doctrine. If anything, they have been preparing for a possible military intervention in Siberia here. Now, assuming that the Polish end up going more nationalist in this time and actually aligning with Germany, it would make sense that the nationalists would not like to give up territory, of course, but they would see this as something that is necessary in an effort to gain further territory, such as dividing Lithuania. In spite of their current position as a German underling, the Polish National Republic, it seems, is still holding ambition for the Commonwealth hegemony. Acknowledging our claim on Memel, Roman Dmowski proposes that we divide the nation, with the Memel region coming under German control and the rest becoming Polish. Yes, an ultimatum is issued and Poland seizes more territory. All of this is to the point that by March of 1939, rearmament is getting extremely expensive. A target for military conquest is necessary, and so over the course of the next several months, Poland is going to be prepared. The anarchy of the Soviet Union will be seen as a perfect staging point for the Germans to claim that in the name of peace in Europe, that they are stepping in order to be able to secure, well, everything, the government, etc. The Allies will, of course, not like this and will likely show some tacit support to different groups within the Soviet Union in order to resist the Germans, but at the same time, there will be no cause for the UK or France to intervene because there will be no invasion of Poland in this time. So it is that by spring of 1939, the planned invasion of Poland that would have taken place, no, that does not take place. Instead, troops are moved to the border, and over this time, justifications are launched in order to build a kind of coalition of varying anti-Soviet forces. You could say that this is where we would see the anti-Russian pact, which is definitely something that could come into play here. And although this is largely going to be a defensive alliance, this is immediately then going to be followed by war with Russia, as the Germans will seek to intervene. This is the point that would be built up for quite literally years. German Reich formalizes anti-Soviet pact. The German Reich has long condemned communism in all forms and has made diplomatic motions to demand other nations oppose it as well. Now the German Reich has offered states under immediate threat from communism a chance to form a pact against the Union of Soviet Republics. Any country in the pact will be committed to fighting a war against the Soviet Union Republic should there come a time when a member is attacked. We can also say from this that some states agree to more, even closer terms, to a offensive alliance as well. Even as perhaps the Russian civil war that could be taking place in this time may be winding down, this would still mean that hundreds of thousands of troops are dead over the span of approximately 2 years worth of fighting. An offer from disgruntled Cossacks, with it becoming ever more clear our intention to kick the rotten door of the Russian Empire. Many of those who lost the Russian Civil War have approached us wishing for a chance to bring an end to the current government. Among those are Don and Cuban Cossacks, Pyotr Krasnov, and Andrei Shurko, who wish to fight for us. Should we accept it? Yes, it is likely, again, in the sense that the Germans are going to build a anti-Russian, anti-Soviet alliance. And so, instead of an invasion of Poland occurring in the fall of 1939, we instead have an invasion or intervention into the Soviet Union it was likely be labeled. The German war machine will finally get used, and from that, it probably would be in a bit of a better economic state than it otherwise would be. Yes, it would not have had trade with the Soviet Union, but without having to exert military power to a greater degree in Spain like it had to, less resources would have been used, and at the same time, seeing the way the winds were turning, perhaps Germany would not have had to invest nearly as much into its military as it did, thus it was able to proceed at a more measured pace economically. Now, it really is a matter of whether or not the German war machine can keep pace with what is necessary. They're not going to have the quick conquest of France. Instead, all resources are going to be dedicated towards the Eastern Front. The future of German rearmament program. The financial tolls of rearmament program risk collapsing our economy. If we mean to keep armament production at the same level as before, we must seek new ways of funding or change our prioritization. Rearmament has always been our goal, thus allowing us to be able to seize the gold of the places that we are going. With the Russians having been engaged in a civil war for over 2 years at this point, the front would very quickly collapse. Maybe a temporary peace of some kind is able to be established, but the likelihood of this is very low. You have to remember that potentially millions of troops on the Soviet side could already be dead, which, yes, this means that the Soviets would actually be far more militarily experienced than they were in our own time, but they would have far less resources. They wouldn't have years of industrial buildup and preparation, and they wouldn't be able to move this equipment out of damaged zones, meaning the factories would be running at severely reduced capacity, meaning the Russian Empire or the Russian state here at this time may have a army that is less than a third its original size. Now, as for how the Western powers would react to all of this, it is uncertain necessarily. Yes, they're likely to throw some support behind different elements within the Soviet Union, especially France, but the UK may not be at this point. The Soviet Union would be in such disarray that before Christmas of 1939, merely, at this point, 3 months into the conflict potentially, Moscow would have already fallen. The Germans would have proceeded at a lightning pace. Yes, this would have been very strenuous on the economy, but at the same time, they would be able to seize gold reserves of wherever it is that they went, thus paying for the conquest that they were launching. Führer Directive 21 would be a success. Mustache Man would think that he is a military strategy genius by this point. The Allies, though likely would have sent some aid over to the Russians, would be content with building themselves up for a potential conflict with Germany. Strong words would obviously be used as tales of the horror and exterminations would be coming out of the Soviet Union, but there wouldn't really be anything that the Allies would do. So bad and so rapid would this complete collapse take place that really by spring of 1940, less than 6-7 months after an invasion, even heading deeper into the Russian steppe where the Germans would have not been prepared for the cold, it means that there would have hardly faced any resistance. Yes, of course, there would have still been mass resistance from the civilian population, but they would have been able to handle this to a horrible degree until eventually the entirety of Russia is put under German occupation. Of course, as compensation, the Poles are going to be granted a significant chunk of territory, potentially increasing the size of their country by a good 50%, which is great because they would have lost half their country as it was to the Germans. Beyond this, the remaining territory of the Russian state would be seized. And with that, we have a German victory. Now, here's the point that we would need to make from this here. Yes, all this occurs by 1940. You think, oh my God, okay, so this means that Germany is naturally going to turn around and go and attack France and the United Kingdom and everything else, right? No, absolutely not. The sheer amount of resources that would have to be expended in order to be able to secure the Russian, not state necessarily, but all the varying different entities within it would be insane. In fact, direct occupation of this is extremely unlikely. Japan, though occupied in China from potentially having to deal with offshoots of Chinese separatists and communists that would have been fighting them, would have likely still participated in the conflict, distracting any Soviet forces that were here on the side, or Russian forces on the side. Thus, they would be granted a limited amount of compensation for their efforts. A series of puppet states are likely to be set up, limiting the actual amount of forces that Germany has to station, but still, large swaths of the former Soviet territory are going to be swept up and gobbled and cleared of people in order to allow for Lebensraum. Now, the thing is, we have to assume that maybe less efforts are necessary from this in Germany in this time because of the sheer amount of devastation that would have already taken place. If the Soviet Union had collapsed over the course of the 1930s, it means that potentially entire massive provinces and states within the Soviet Union would have been depopulated, as millions of people would have died from a mixture of the war, starvation, etc., thus allowing the Germans to effectively move in as free real estate, almost. And from there, they would not be able to continue conquest. Yes, the German Reich would be able to go and drastically boost its industry, but the sheer amount of manpower that would be necessary in order to be able to occupy the territory that was taken would be a heavy toll upon the state. They would have to continuously extract resources from the remaining Russian population in order to be able to pay for the industries that were massively in debt. And from here, potentially the next 3, 4, maybe even 5 years will be spent consolidating their hold before it is that the Germans are able to look outward. And hopefully, the Ponzi scheme that is the fascist economy would actually be able to last during that time. If not, well, there's always an invasion of France. But by that point, the Allies would have had not just 3 or 4 years of preparation like they had in our own time, they would have had 9 to 10 years worth of prep, meaning the United Kingdom, France, and all the varying colonies, as well as the United States, which would have been slowly dragging itself out of the Great Depression, would be fully prepared to combat the German menace. That is the most likely scenario for what would happen in the event that the Soviet Union collapsed first. But we can also say then that, well, all those resistance groups that would pop up within the Soviet Union are going to create a much more fragile state, making the Germans far stronger and yet weaker at the same time. With that, my friends, I think we're going to end things here today. Thank you all very much for watching. Please let me know in the comment section below what it is that we should try to tackle next in a fairly realistic way. And besides that, I will see you all here next time. Goodbye, my friends. Thanks for watching.